Good afternoon. My name is Luke Emery, and today I'm going to be talking about the Winter War. Kind of starting off with some important background information. The conflict was mainly between Finland and Russia, and it was also considered to be the first Soviet-Finnish war, and that's really just due to the two countries having a history of conflict and all being prior to the Soviet Union. There was about 1.1 million people involved. Finland's forces contained approximately 340,000 people, while Russia had approximately 760,000 people, over double Finnish forces. The war did last from November 30th to 1939, and it ended in the 13th of March 1940, so it lasted a complete 3 months, 1 week, and 6 days. And then temperatures for this war were kind of a major factor, with the low reaching negative 43 degrees Celsius or negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning that combat conditions were extremely harsh for both sides of the war. Yes, Finnish and Russian soldiers are known for fighting in the winter, but negative 45 degrees is pretty harsh no matter who you are. France has always supported Finland because they saw an opportunity to weaken Germany resource imports. Nazi Germany was getting a lot of their steel to support the war machine imported in from places like Sweden, so France hoped to slow that down or completely destroy that import. Britain also supported the Finnish, wanting a British foothold in Scandinavia, but didn't really ever end up doing so because they didn't want to become in conflict with Russia and just felt they should stay out of Finland and Russia's conflict. Finally, Germany had a great interest in the Winter War. They kind of looked in the shadows. They never really played any major role in it, but they were very interested to see who was going to come out victorious. So we're leading up to the war. There was quite a bit going on. There was a lot of contention, a lot of resentment between Russians and Finnish people, with a very long history of Russia invading Finland or vice versa or whatever. There was a revolution, there was a counter-revolution, there was even a civil war that lasted from 1917 to 1918. To give some context, Russia had annexed Finland from Sweden in 1809, but because Russia wanted to pretty much incorporate Finland as just Russia, this ended up ruining the relationship between the two countries because Finland didn't want to be part of Russia. And then, so really, the Russians wished for an alliance with Finland. They wanted some land too, but really the alliance wasn't necessary. They, at the very least, wanted a promise from Finland that they would not aid Nazi Germany in fighting Russia. And then in 1938, the Sudeten crisis happened, where pan-Germanists requested that Nazi Germany take over this land, and they did so. And then Finland was quite worried over this because they kind of felt now that they're going to get invaded either way, so they might as well just kind of stick to their guns and stand and fight. As a result of that, in 1939, Finland remilitarized and hopes to protect the Northern Europe, basically in Scandinavia. While they did so, they needed a lot of help from Sweden because they had previously wished to be neutral, so they didn't have much of anything going on for them. Thus, after remilitarizing, Finland sends a lot of its forces at the border with Russia, and Russia saw this as an act of aggression. And the Russians even went as far to claim that Finnish artillery was being fired at Russian soldiers, and the Finnish leadership did not believe that, so they decided to send people out to the border to kind of check things out. And what they had found was that the artillery strike actually came from 2 kilometers within Russia, and it, according to them, was just Russia firing on its own people. So Finland they definitely denied any involvement with striking Russian forces before the war. So some important events. So starting off, like I said earlier, the Soviet forces invaded Finland on the 30th of November 1939, and they heavily bombed Helsinki. Not that there was a lot of Finnish troops or really any military presence there. The Russians hoped to kind of demoralize Finland by attacking civilians and taking lots of buildings with the bombing raids, and especially in the capital of the country. The battles of the Mannerheim Line were basically the result of the Finnish being unable to use guerrilla tactics because of the terrain. There was just not much cover, not really any woods. It was very hard to kind of be sneaky and use guerrilla tactics. So instead, they decided to kind of revert to tradition almost. And the Mannerheim Line was pretty much just a series of simple trenches, with some being reinforced by log coverings. But Russia didn't feel it was that simple. They actually felt that it was stronger even than the Maginot Line, and it took a lot of effort and a lot of forces to take that line from Finland. There was also the Battle of Kola, which lasted pretty much the entirety of the war, though, and Finland was able to hold it most of the time, and that kind of bred this famous motto called Kola Holds. A kind of key figure in the Battle of Kola who helped demoralize the Russians a little bit was a legendary sniper by the name of Smohaya. He had 500 kills, and the Russians were even so scared of him that they called him the White Death. Other than France and Britain, Australia came to Finland's aid on December 19th, 1939. Working mainly through the Red Cross, they didn't really send any combat forces. They were almost more sneaky about it because there was a lot of conflict within Australia of whether or not they should be helping the Finlands, and there was a communist party even that wanted to aid Russia. So it was kind of a sneakily done thing. Finally, the Finnish Laplands is pretty much the area in northern Finland next to the Arctic Circle. And because of where it's located, there was very inhospitable, not a lot of buildings or really no trees or anything. It was a very harsh environment. So the Finnish didn't really expect the Russians to come from the north. Maybe a handful of raiding parties or a small number of troops, but actually Russians did invade, and it was with 35,000 people. And so during the Battle of Salla, the Russians kind of initially were taking land quite fast. They didn't meet much opposition until the Finnish kind of halted the advance by using a counterattack on the Russians. One of the main kind of key points of northern Finland, too, was Petsamo. It was the only Finnish port that wasn't frozen over in the north. So it was a very good, very big trade route for them. But the issue of it was it tactically did not have a lot of ways to defend it. It was a hard place to defend. There was not a lot of like natural cover or terrain cover. So really that port ended up changing hands a couple of times throughout the war because it was challenging for both armies to hold that spot. Moving on to the end of the war. So the Soviet forces had faced a high number of casualties. I mean, of course, they had over double the amount of forces than Finland did. But Finland faced casualties as well, but they were more so exhausted from the fighting. It's been a long war, very cold, very harsh conditions, and the Russians were relentless, so they were getting very tired. There was a lot of talk of peace, and people were hoping that the war was going to end, and so it really did end with the Moscow Peace Treaty. It ended on March 1940 with the treaty stating that Finland had to give up 9% of its territory to Russia, which is unfortunate for Finland because they actually ended up losing more than what was initially asked for. Which Russia initially asked for only 9% of territory, but they also gained 12% of Finland's population and 13% of economic population and assets. So Finland ended up losing a lot more than what had been initially stated by the Russians. Even though they won the war, the Russians lost a lot of respect from other nations because a lot of these other major powers didn't really see how this country had such a hard time fighting off Finland or kind of invading this smaller country. And so the ego of Russia, if anything, was hurt quite a bit. Although they did keep a lot of stuff from Finland, Petsamo, the non-frozen port up north, was returned to Finland. It's just the Russians didn't feel like they needed it, and they feel like it was okay if the Finnish had it. And then finally, the war was honestly a great political success for Germany, who was still in the shadows, still watching. They really wanted Russia to face heavier losses than they had already. But nonetheless, Russia's ego was down. They had a weakened army after this conflict, as Russia didn't think it was going to take this long to take Finland. And Finland itself, even though they lost and had their tail between their legs, the Germans looked to them and said, hey, we can help you out. We can get revenge on the Russians. Let's join us in World War II and we can go fight. So that's what they did. Kind of pretty much, even though they lost, they did exactly what Russia didn't want them to do, and that was fight with the Germans against Russia. Here are my sources. Thank you.